Thanks very much, Alex, for those kind words, and thanks to Amina for getting up so early and inspiring us. And also, I do want to say thanks to Paul very much for not just his speech today, but his absolutely tireless and relentless work that him and his team have done around the Spy Cops inquiry. That has done something to puncture the confidentiality, the privacy, the secrecy that surrounds those kinds of operations. So, big round of applause for Paul Herrick. Yesterday there were apparently 100 police vans at the DOJ protest. And obviously we all know that all the different demonstrations we go to, you see these massive concentrations of police. In fact, demonstrations and protests and sometimes picket lines are the only time we ever see that level of concentration of police. And that in itself tells a story, I think. People say, quite rightly, someone said it to me last night, what a waste of public money, what a waste of police time. And in a way they're right, but in a way they're not. Because the truth is, they are only doing their job when they come to protests and demonstrations, because their job, their fundamental purpose of the police, and this is not an exaggeration, this is a historical truth, the fundamental purpose of the police, there are others, but the main drive behind the creation of the police actually was precisely to deal with demonstrations, to deal with protest, and to deal with dissent. The British police forces were set up in the 1830s, largely as a response to mass agitation for the vote and for democracy. The classic example, the classic sort of moment that generated a discussion in the establishment and in the ruling class about the need to set up a police force came about in the months and years, actually, because it was a process, after the Peterloo massacre of 1819, where it was a demonstration for electoral reform in Manchester, near Manchester, and 18 people were killed and about 400 or 500 were very seriously injured. And this caused absolute outrage across society, including in polite society. What the debate centred around in the British establishment was the need for a force that could control and wound and arrest if necessary, and sometimes kill, but not often if possible, to replace the cavalry, the yeomanry that used cutlasses and pistols to try and in their operations against demonstrators up to that time. It was recognised that that level of brutality in the domestic politics on the streets of Britain was going to cause too much upset. So the police were a specific organisation. The Metropolitan Police came first, but others spread across the country in the 1830s, specifically to deal with this problem. The cutlass, the pistol was replaced with the baton. You could use the baton with one hand, with the other hand you could arrest people. It was about being able to control, being able to repress without creating the kind of furore that followed from the Peterloo massacre. And this is also, by the way, when the kind of the myth of the Bobby on the beat started to develop as well. There was a whole operation to make it seem as if it was about the community, as well as about protest and dissent. But the way that policing has been carried out ever since in this country and elsewhere is always determined by the kind of social force, the kind of balance of forces in society, the debates that are taking place, the level of conflict that's operating in society at any particular time. And I think that what's happening now is the kind of culmination of a trend that began really at the end of the long boom in the 1960s, that ended in the late 1960s or early 1970s, where for a few decades after the Second World War, there was a kind of consensus, don't want to exaggerate it, but there was a kind of grudging acceptance of the role of the police as, somehow standing above society. And that ended in the late 60s and early 1970s with a series of struggles and conflicts when protests really re-emerged, and they were dealt with quite brutally, and then it ended finally with the election of Thatcher in 1979 and a complete kind of semi-militarisation of the police that was necessary, that Thatcher regarded as being necessary, partly to deal with the riots in the early 1980s, mainly led by black communities up and down the country that were dealt with very brutally, but also the understanding that the ruling class had that in order to introduce the free market politics of neoliberalism and so forth, they needed to crush the organised working class. And you saw set pieces in the mid-80s where the police were central to the crushing of the miners and the printers after them, and that had a very, very serious impact on society. And I think there's a kind of, what followed was a kind of authoritarian loop, really, where in order to create this new kind of society, or this sort of new version of capitalism, they needed the violence and the repression to begin with, but also the policies of privatisation, cutbacks, austerity and so on and so forth, created a situation where they needed more police to be able to control actually increased crime that existed in these societies, but also the continuous resistance or the waves of resistance that have developed since. With the advent, sort of moving forwards to the 2000s, I think the war on terror, so-called, was another turning point, really, because what happened there was a social panic that was generated against so-called terrorism, but was really a form of racism and Islamophobia that was kind of projected and developed across society, where you had an increase in surveillance of the Muslim communities, a heightening of anti-Asian and anti-Muslim racism, and an increase in police powers, and the police were very central even to the prevent operation. So then, of course, you had, after 2008, you have the banking crisis and austerity that comes out of that. Then a new round of legislation that Paul mentioned that has been introduced since then, as we reached a situation over the last 15 years of probably the greatest amount of protest there's ever been in terms of street protests and demonstrations and marches, not just in Britain, but in many countries around the world. And so I think that the draconian response to the Palestine movement has plenty of historical precedents, as Paul was saying, and is also part of this trend. I think partly it comes out of, and obviously we've all been spending quite a lot of time, including Alex, by the way, who I must mention as well is facing charges, unfortunately. But we've all been discussing these issues at some length, and I think partly what's happened with the Palestine movement is the repression comes out of the fact that the establishment's support for Israel is absolutely fundamental, it's absolutely baked in, it's embedded in the British establishment across the political parties. And yet, what they are doing, what Israel is doing, has become so unpopular that increasingly they've lost the argument, and so they have to respond in an authoritarian manner. But I also think there's something else going on here, actually, which is that I suspect after the 7th of October 2023, the establishment made the assumption that in those circumstances it was going to be fairly easy to marginalise the Palestine movement, to criminalise the Palestine movement, and sort of present it or turn it into an essentially Muslim issue, a kind of niche issue, and to use the whole weaponisation of anti-Semitism to really put it to the side and to make it appear to be something that most people couldn't and wouldn't want to relate to. And if you think about it, and in that sense, I think it's part and parcel, or it's an element of a longer campaign to try and take apart and take down the anti-war and anti-imperialist left in this country. And if you think about it, what they use the anti-Semitism stuff as the main, or certainly as one of the two main ways of trying to defeat Corbynism. And they must have thought about that and thought about, okay, well, let's do what we did to Corbyn to the street movement. Okay. So I'm going to end by a couple of things. Really, first of all, saying that hasn't gone according to plan. The movement has been incredibly resilient. It has pushed back. Yesterday was an example of that. But also, after the attack on us on January the 18th, I think they thought people weren't going to come out again. But actually, the movement strengthened. And the demonstrations actually grew in the period after that demonstration. And that's tremendously important. I think that sympathy for the Palestinians, mobilisation for the Palestinians, opposition to what Israel is doing, particularly in the way that things have played out, has actually been increasing. And you can see that in the opinion polls, not just the number of people going out on the streets, but the support and the sympathy for our positions is growing. So I want to end with just 3 points in terms of a discussion about how we should respond. And the first thing is, I think it's very important that we fight on all fronts, including inside the institutions, because, and that means building, that means, talking about the media, thinking about Parliament, thinking about the courts as well, without getting too bogged down in, massive number of cases and fighting defensively in the courts. Nevertheless, we do need to deal with the institutions as best we can, have an impact on them, because there is, in Britain, a tremendous history, which is a product actually of the decades-long or century-long struggle for a democracy in this country. There is a tremendous respect and sense of the importance of free speech and free assembly. That is something that I think we can and must continue to relate to. And then secondly, we have to pay attention to the kind of ideological arguments that Paul raised. We have to take on the question of anti-Semitism and the weaponisation of anti-Semitism against us, and we have to take it on with confidence. We have to push it back. That was one of the big mistakes that the Corbyn movement made, was actually to make and the question of, I will just say, the question of serial disruption, cumulative impact. This is something we've got to constantly fight back again, and I think we do it by saying that every serious campaign that has ever won anything major has always involved demonstration after demonstration, month in, month out, week in, week out, year in, year out, whether it's the vote, whether it's the votes for women, whether it's the anti-apartheid campaign. It's always about coming back, and that's why they're actually using this cumulative disruption thing. And the very final thing I want to say, it is the very final thing, sorry. It's just about the nature of the movement itself, because very much take on board the things that Paul says, that we shouldn't see ourselves as a marginalised minority. We have to understand that these attacks are actually defensive and reflexive, because they're worried about the level of opposition, about the level of protest, about the power of the movement. And there was a very simple but telling point that was made by a former police commissioner in The Guardian in 2023 after the 11th of September demonstration, 11th of November demonstration, where he said the reason we couldn't move against the Palestine movement at that stage was that there were simply too many people in the streets. And if we attacked them, it would look as if we were attacking the whole of society. And I found the Minneapolis example incredibly inspiring. Every community in that city, every trade union, every area was mobilised in a series of massive demonstrations that reached deep, deep into the community. And that's the kind of movement we've got to build. And our next big target has to be May the 16th, when Tommy Robinson is trying to stop us march for Nakba. We've got to have that kind of outgoing organisation and movement response, and be in our hundreds of thousands on the street on May the 16th. Thank you.